and welcome back. You're watching World Talks, and I'm your host, Klaudia Czerwińska. The informal meeting of EU defense ministers in Warsaw is taking place this very moment, and yet again it brought to the forefront the discussions regarding the rearming of Europe and the role of the EU in bringing a just peace to the war in Ukraine. In the meantime, increased defense investment will be the key item on the agenda of today's NATO Foreign Ministers Summit in Brussels. Apart from expanding defense budgets, the officials are set to discuss the war in Ukraine and relations with the partners from the Indo-Pacific region. Joining me now to talk all things defense. In the context of the said meetings, I'm joined by Shea, former NATO Deputy Assistant Secretary General for Emerging Security Challenges. Good morning. Thank you for joining.
Good morning to you too.
So let's begin by what we've heard from European Commissioner for Defense, Andrius Kubilius. He said, I quote, intelligence services report Russia is getting ready to challenge NATO Article 5 by 2030. Do you think this is a possible threat?
Yes, it's certainly a possible threat because we obviously know that Russia is on a high stage of defense production at the moment. Its defense industries are running 24/7, churning out lots of missiles, tanks, armored personnel carriers. And this situation is probably going to continue even after some kind of ceasefire or peace agreement is reached in Ukraine. And you therefore have to worry or wonder why Russia is doing this. So there is definitely a Russian threat to Eastern Europe, to NATO countries, and it's obviously very clear that NATO has to make sure that it's in a position to deter that threat or to counter any Russian aggression if it would actually take place.
So we've heard from Mr. Kubilius. Now let's jump into Polish Foreign Minister Radosław Sikorski. He said readiness will deter, weakness encourages aggression. Do you think that projects such as, for example, Eastern Shield are going to give enough of a signal to Russia to stay away, to stay put? And what more could actually be done to enhance the deterrence on the eastern flank?
Well, I think there are two aspects to Eastern Shield. The first aspect is to deal with the things that are below the threshold of a conventional armed attack. The things like the cyber attack against Donald Tusk's party that you were talking about just a moment ago, what NATO often calls hybrid warfare, the sabotage operations against critical energy infrastructure and telecommunications cables in the Baltic. And of course, something that you in Poland have experienced, which is illegal migrants being pushed over the border from Belarus. So part of this is to develop the ability to anticipate these kind of hybrid campaigns, sabotage, infiltration, and disinformation, and to be in a position to coordinate quick responses, identifying where they're coming from, and taking retaliatory responses, actions, for example, such as sanctions or travel bans or asset freezes or expulsion of diplomats. The second aspect of Eastern Shield is the more conventional military aspect, where, of course, there is a need to improve NATO's air and ballistic missile defense in the region. We've seen some of the vulnerabilities recently with drones from Russia arriving in Poland or in Romania. So that air and missile shield definitely needs to be stepped up. And of course, continuing to upgrade and increase the number of NATO troops in the region. This week, good news, Germany has now moving ahead with establishing a brigade in Lithuania. And I think we need to see other NATO forces in the region stepped up as well. So there is an effective conventional deterrent as well as a good deterrent against these hybrid campaigns.
So seeing how things are when it comes to Donald Trump's U.S. administration and the relationship between the European Union and the U.S. when it comes to, especially when it comes to the subject of Russia and Ukraine, do you think that the U.S. administration would actually be worried? Should the U.S. administration be worried? And would they be worried if this article would be violated by Russia and another European country could be actually attacked?
Well, yes, of course the US should be worried because it has a NATO commitment under that Article 5 to come to the defence of that NATO ally. And so far, despite many criticisms of Trump and the Trump administration of NATO, particularly defence spending, not by Poland, which of course is a star at over 4% of GDP on defence, but inadequate defence spending by some other NATO allies. But despite that criticism, the Trump administration has been firm in its commitment to NATO and to Article 5. The new American ambassador to NATO, Matt Whitaker, has said to the Senate just a couple of days ago that that commitment is ironclad, and we have, continuing every day of the week, American forces participating in NATO exercises, demonstrating the American readiness to reinforce Europe. Tragically, 4 American soldiers died in an accident in Lithuania, but at least that does show that the Americans are in Lithuania exercising with their NATO allies. So I do think that, despite some of the talk and rhetoric we hear from time to time, the reality is that the United States is fulfilling all of its NATO commitments.
I would like to take a moment to actually take a look at 2 plans that were mentioned during the meeting, the white papers on European defense and the Readiness 2030 plan. Why are they important, and what are they for those of our viewers who might not actually have had a look at what they are and what they mean for Europe?
Well, basically, the key thing, and I think this is going to be the topic of the meeting in Warsaw today of the EU defence ministers, is to turn money into capabilities. I mean, in the last couple of weeks, we've had good news from EU summits in Brussels that there will be 150 billion euros in a safe investment fund for multinational investments in defence. This will rise to 800 billion euros over the next few years. So for the first time, we have real money on the table, and the financial mechanisms like deficit spending, loans, more investment from pension funds and banks and so on. We have finally the resources to get our defence industries in Europe working. But of course, this is no good if we're not able to agree on the priorities, on the projects, and use the money wisely. So the white paper and the Rearm Europe initiative are really all about now choosing the priorities and seeing which European countries are willing to come together. I think the objective in Warsaw today is to define 20 key capability projects which will fill the most urgent gaps that NATO has, and present those to Trump at the NATO summit in The Hague in June as evidence that the Europeans are really stepping up to their responsibility.
I would like to take a moment and look at a statement that preceded the summit, the NATO summit, and the statement came from NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte. He said that the meeting will focus on strengthening the alliance's collective defense, adding that it remains the foundation of NATO's and Pact's top priority. Some analysts, when they look at NATO, they say that NATO might be going through an existential crisis. How would you comment on this?
Well, I don't think the facts bear that out. I mean, for example, when Pete Hegseth, the US Secretary of Defense, was at NATO recently, he said, I want a more lethal NATO. But NATO is certainly a lot more lethal today than it was back in 2014 when Russia annexed Crimea. Many countries have moved towards that 2% of GDP defense spending target. Not all, but the great majority. Every day now you see countries announce big new programs to modernize defense. Yesterday it was Greece announcing a budget of 25 billion euros on modernization. Today, Bulgaria is receiving 16 new American F-16 fighter jets. So the news is that Europe really is now making that effort. Yes, it needs to do more, but the process is well launched. So I would say that NATO is stronger during Trump 2 than it was during Trump 1. Things are moving in the right direction. And if you look at Central and Eastern Europe today, Europeans are much more in the front line of European defense in the Baltic states, in Finland, in Poland, of course, and also on the Black Sea, than they were in West Germany during the Cold War, when, of course, the Americans were a very high percentage of that capability. So I think the key thing for the United States is to look at the reality of NATO, what really is going on, and not have this sort of stereotype of the Americans are doing everything and the Europeans are doing nothing, which may have been slightly true 20 years ago, but really isn't the reality today.
We're having this meeting in Warsaw. We have the NATO meeting in Brussels. Meanwhile, Russia has raised the number of conscripts that they're trying to reach by spring to 160,000, making it actually the biggest military call-up in years. This does not seem like a country that is looking for peace, does it?
Well, this is exactly what we were saying at the beginning of our interview. Everything that you see from Russia today suggests a war economy, a country which is preparing for war and which has every intention of conducting future wars, and certainly is not going to be satisfied by the acquisition of more territory in Ukraine, but wants, of course, to bring many parts of Central and Eastern Europe back into the Russian orbit. And we also have a Russian leader who has seriously violated every agreement that he has signed up to. And so, yes, NATO has to be very careful. We, of course, don't also know where Russia will be going after Mr. Putin finally leaves the scene, although there's no sign that that's going to happen anytime soon. And we also, of course, have Russia, which is undermining the West in many other ways, in the Mediterranean, in North Africa, sending Wagner mercenaries, for example, to parts of Africa as well, building bases in Sudan, obviously supporting Iran and groups like the Houthis. So Russian foreign policy goes beyond Central and Eastern Europe. It's a major challenge for the West, and NATO needs a multifaceted strategy, including cooperation with those Asia-Pacific partners, to be able to address the multidimensionality of the Russian challenge.
The time on our program is slightly coming to an end, but before we go, I wanted to move slightly to the world of economics, because we had this announcement in the Rose Garden in Washington of the tariffs that are going to impose. What influence do you think those tariffs and that tension that's being created right now is going to have on defense, especially when it comes to Europe?
Well, of course, it's not going to be easy, although so far we don't see that, for example, defence trade is going to be immediately impacted in terms of high technology or defence components. The Americans do a lot of business in Europe. Indeed, about 60% of the money that the European countries spend outside Europe on new defence equipment, 60% of that money goes to the United States. I just mentioned those new American, of course, F-16s arriving in Bulgaria, and when the Americans see countries like Greece decide to spend 25 billion euros on new air defense and equipment, of course American defense contractors will want a big share of that particular pie. It's good business for them. So I expect the United States to be pushing hard that there should be some kind of transatlantic agreement on defense, which will continue to allow US companies to benefit from the greater investment that Europeans are making. And I think the tough choice for the Europeans is going to be to decide, how much of that money they give to America, because America could have the best equipment, or because they want to maintain a transatlantic relationship, and how much money they spend in Europe to promote jobs and the technology base within the European Union itself. That's going to be a difficult balance, and I'm sure that defense ministers in Warsaw today will be spending some time discussing that issue.
Definitely there's going to be a discussion around that subject. Jamie Shea, former NATO Deputy Assistant Secretary General for Emerging Security Challenges, thank you for joining.
Thank you.
And so this would be all for now here on World Talks, but please do stay tuned. We have a news breakdown by Diana Skaya coming up in just a moment.